So my colleagues in Bangor would not forgive me if I didn't correct our location. It's actually in Bangor, Maine, and not Belfast. Belfast is actually my home. So I want to thank Larry Bauer and Jennifer Stamper, and also you, Heather, for the very kind introduction, and for this great opportunity to return to a place quite familiar to me. I did my residency right across the river in York, Pennsylvania, a number of years ago, across the Susquehanna. We had interviewed in so many residency programs that I couldn't quite remember where York was until on the nightly news flashed on the screen the 3 Mile Island disaster, which showed York on one side and Lancaster on the other. So it brought me very close to the reality of my first few years in residency. Now I need to, oh, there we go. So, I think I'd like to begin today, since we are in such a beautiful, bucolic surroundings, to begin with a poem, to place us, to give thanks for the greenery around us and the peace around us, and the Sunday morning that we have together. This is a poem by someone I regard as really one of, or maybe the founder, the father, the mother of family medicine, the poet Wendell Berry. And Wendell Berry, one of his more famous poems is A Piece of Wild Things. So I'd like to read that to you now. When despair grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests, in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water. And I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting for their light. For a time I rest in the grace of the world and am free. That's Wendell Berry, whose book, The Unsettling of America, was a huge influence on me when I was a fourth-year medical student trying to decide exactly what I wanted to do and where I wanted to be. So I'm going to talk this morning about retooling the generalist practitioner, and these are just simply my thoughts, my observations of having spent over 3 decades of my life in rural practice, having been taught by my patients, as many of the older clinicians here in the room have been taught by their patients as well. And I think of Eric Brown, a colleague of mine, Louis Melbadrona. These become our real teachers in family medicine if we take the time to listen and learn from them. So I'm going to ask 3 questions this morning. What does primary care become? What do our patients need from us? And how do we align their needs with ours? How do we align their needs with ours? Because without taking their needs into account, what have we become? And without taking our needs into account, how can we care for them over a lifetime in family medicine? So I'm going to begin with what does primary care become? A reality of family medicine, primary care, is that we, family physicians, are no longer the mainstay. Currently in practice, 62% of the workforce in primary care are physicians, but that's changing rapidly. Nurse practitioners have 77% of the number of people in training. PAs 10%, physicians 14%. 23,000 NPs graduate every year, and the majority of them go into primary care. So family physicians, on the other hand, graduate about 5,000. So quickly, we're becoming one of the many in primary care, and the majority is going actually to nurse practitioners. It's just a reality that we need to accommodate. Our scope of practice is narrowing. This is from a study from data from the American Board of Family Medicine, and it appeared a couple of years ago. 81% of us, 3 years into our practice, are doing ambulatory care, 13% nursing home, 12% walk-in, only 8% home visits. 31% of us still spend time in the hospital, 14% perform deliveries, and 6% are involved in emergency care. And just to underscore the changing nature of ownership, 13% are sole or partial owners in their own practice, and only 4% are in solo practice. The third point is that the family has left family medicine. And this may not be true in your residency program, but in practice, this is happening increasingly, in part by our own choices, in part by the choices of those who employ us. On the right is a family farm. I grew up in rural Iowa, and the family farms when I was growing up were a population of about 8 or 9 people on the farm. It was a family-owned business. Average farm size was about 250 acres. Generally, we rotated crops between corn and soybeans and barley or wheat or some other crop. And then every year, one of the fields, one of the sections remained fallow. Nowadays, when I return home, I see vast open areas where the most prominent structure is no longer the silo, but rather the wind turbine, and the farms are 2,500 acres, many of them now corporate owned. We've lost the roadmap in family medicine, the roadmap being the genogram. How do you push a genogram into an electronic record that doesn't want to receive it? Ownership, as you saw from the previous slide, we no longer own our work, we work for others. And this has changed, really, the nature of family medicine. Size, again, the size of our practices, the size of our networks is growing increasingly large. There's very little evidence that this has benefited patients, but it's certainly benefited those who sponsored this, were the key sponsors today. Monoculture, we're increasingly leaving our fellowships doing primarily one thing rather than many things. And just as the farm is no longer a farm that includes cows and pigs and sheep, chickens, and a multiplicity of crops, now farmers in Iowa, in my neighborhood, grow one crop, corn or soybeans, and export it to the world. And lastly, whereas in the family farm, farmers only relied on veterinarians when the births of their sheep or their cattle were complicated. Now those births don't happen on the farm anymore, and increasingly they're not happening for us as family physicians. We're not at the bedside when a person dies or is nearing death. We're not making home visits to those who are dying at home. We're not in the OB suite helping women deliver. So this is said without judgment. It's just a reality of kind of the changing nature of family medicine. And I would say lastly, we seem to be less and less prepared for the future. All kind of things confronted me when I returned to teaching in a residency program after being in a residency program some 3.5 decades earlier. We are kind of slow to get on the bandwagon of how quickly family medicine and primary care is changing. We have multidisciplinary teams, but we really don't know how to operate with them. We know that telemedicine is a big part of certainly rural medicine, remote medicine, but we don't have much experience doing it. We have been slow to get on board with artificial intelligence, which is going to be a large part of the future of primary care. We've become more involved with transactional medicine rather than relational medicine, and you already heard this from Rebecca Etz yesterday morning. We are concerned about 4-year residencies and +1 residencies and fellowships, and there's really little evidence that we need all of this education. What we need mostly, in my opinion, is to be involved with patients who will teach us what we need to know. And then lastly, we have had to become accustomed to Dr. Google, who many of our patients consult before seeing this. This had positive benefits. I think we probably see and hear from a lot fewer patients on call because of consultations to Dr. Google, but they also bring a longer conversation about what the best next step ought to be in their care. So I'm suggesting today that maybe the torch has passed from what my father did and really what I did in the early years of my practice in Belfast, Maine, we called it family medicine. For me, it was simply the general practice of my father with a new name. As family medicine matured and we started to become more involved with behavioral health and all of the other things that family medicine adheres to and believes in, we've finally come to the point now where I would like to suggest that we need to really think about who we are and what our future entails. What is the future we'd like to create for ourselves? And I'm going to call that generalist practice, and we'll try to explain that to you in a couple of minutes. So what do our patients need? And here's really where I think we all need to pay attention to the changing needs of patients and our changing needs. But what do our patients need? So I'm going to talk a little bit about my many years as a full spectrum family physician in Belfast, Maine. This is Belfast. It's really quite a beautiful place. I was instantly taken by it when my wife and I were trying to decide where we wanted to begin my practice of medicine and our life together. We were coming down Northport Hill and got to the center of town, the only stoplight in Waldo County, Maine. And all of a sudden, we were at the red light, and all of a sudden, this long line of people with bonnets and white coats and Wellington boots were walking up the street. And it was like right out of a Kafka novel. It was just surreal. And I said, I have to be here to understand what's going on in this community. As it turns out, these were the workers from Penobscot Poultry Plant in Belfast. 1 or 2 years before it closed, Maplewood Poultry Plant had closed a couple of years earlier, and Belfast was in the midst of a transition of reimagining itself. And I've, over the years, reimagined myself with Belfast. So here's a picture of Belfast, Maine. It's very pretty from a few thousand feet above it, and a little more gritty once you get down into it. So when I first started in Belfast, I was just part of the medical community. My best friend was my partner, Tim Hughes. Our social life revolved around the doctors we made friends with when we first moved there. And so all I knew when I came to Belfast was this medical community. After a period of time, obviously one needs to eat, buy clothing, do whatever you need to do. So I began to understand that there was a town around the hospital and my office. Our friendships began to develop outside of the medical community. I got on a local softball team and made friends through that. I worked out at the YMCA and made more acquaintances. And obviously, as we started having a family, my wife and I, our best friends really came from the school system that our children went to, the public schools our children went to. But as I got involved as a county medical examiner, county coroner, as I started to do more home visits, as I got involved in the care of patients with opioid use disorder, I realized there was a whole community I wasn't seeing, I wasn't a part of. They weren't a part of me. And that was the shut-ins and the mentally ill and the homeless and the addicted. And I got to know them very slowly over time, and almost out of a sense of denial. The whole community really was in a denial until we realized that the young kids, the children of my children's favorite teachers in school, the kids who were now leaving to go to college, for which our community was so proud, were now struggling with their many problems that we were ignoring. So my understanding of what the role of a family doctor was beginning to change and expand in very important ways. We heard from Rebecca Etz yesterday about the importance of a personal relationship and to consider ourselves personal doctors for those we care for. I want to talk about the nature of that personal relationship. And it has to do, for me, with becoming part of a community. community being such an important part of what it means to being a family doctor. So what is the nature of any personal relationship? When you get involved or intimate or serious with another human being, what does it mean to be in a personal relationship? Well, you accept responsibility for your words and actions. You move in together at some point. You show affection. It's so important to offer flowers on a holiday or a special occasion or a birthday. You make a long-term investment to one another. You widen the circle of your relationships, knowing that you can't sustain yourselves on that, or for most of us, we can't sustain ourselves in that one relationship alone. And then you work for what you believe in. Most oftentimes, if you have children, it's for your children. So let me talk about what that means in terms of a community. When I first came to Belfast, I wanted to do obstetrics very badly. And of course, since I didn't have skills in cesarean section, I knew I had to work closely with an obstetrician. There happened to be one in town. His name was Claude Coons. And so when I first arrived, I said, I really want to talk to Dr. Coons, and I had heard he was from Des Moines. He was from Des Moines, Iowa, as I was from Iowa. And I thought, well, that would be a point of connection. So I talked to Dr. Coons, I talked to the receptionist who was kind of guarding the door to the entrance into his exam rooms. And I started chatting her up. Her name was Nancy Coons. Turns out she was the wife of Claude. And I said, so Nancy, where are you from? Are you from Iowa too? And she says, yes, I am. And I said, so whereabouts in Iowa? And she said, well, I'm from near Fort Dodge. Well, I said, I'm from near Fort Dodge too. I grew up near Fort Dodge. And so where near Fort Dodge? And she said, well, you probably haven't heard of it, Pocahontas County. And I was kind of stunned because I was from Pocahontas County too. And I said, okay, so where from Pocahontas County are you from? And it turns out that my father, a general practitioner, likely delivered her. Her father ran the elevator in town, grain elevator in town, and my dad was the GP. And we had this instant connection, Claude and Nancy. A few years later, Claude taught me one of the most important things, one of the most important things in being in a small town, and that is accepting responsibility. So in those days, we were in a shared practice. That is, in a group of 4, one of us would be on obstetrics and the emergency room and nursing home call, and only work half days seeing patients, and the others would be in the office seeing patients for those weeks. So 1 week out of 4, we were very busy and very much involved in the hospital. I remember very distinctly. It was just, we shifted on Friday afternoon, and I remember I'd had a hard week. Things had not gone well in the office, and on. Many things were weighing on my mind. And on Friday morning, a patient of mine came in labor. I thought, great, she was a multip. I thought, well, let's make sure, as much as I had any control over this, let's make sure that she delivers by 5 o'clock. As you all know, in obstetrics, things don't work out the way you intend, quite oftentimes, and I could see by 4 o'clock things are not going well, by 5 o'clock still not fully dilated, by 6 o'clock I was getting exceedingly worried, but really with full knowledge that this labor was going to C-section. So I called Claude and I said, Claude, I think you need to come in, explain the circumstances, and he came in for the C-section. And as we were doing the C-section, all I could think about was how unfair it was for me to be there when I was now several hours beyond my sign out to my partner. How unfair it was. I'd had a terrible week, and now I was being forced to be here at the C-section as first assist. And of course, as I was so preoccupied, I started not paying attention to where my retractor was or what sutures needed to be snipped and so forth. Claude would kind of look up at me and wrinkle his eyebrow a little bit, and finally he said to me, he said, David, you really don't have to be here. I'll call the nurse in, the circulating nurse, to first assist. And it struck me like a lightning bolt that here I was complaining about a place that I chose to come to, a discipline I felt fervently about, family medicine, a job I had accepted willingly and agreed to this patient to be there for her when she needed me. And I was completely ignoring all that out of my fatigue and my sense of what I felt I deserved. And it taught me from then on that, this is really our job. I was visiting some people in London, Ontario recently, and there was a wonderful little sign in the clinic director's office, and it said, "Yes, doing your job is part of your job." And this was part of my job, was to be for that patient. So Claude taught me a really, really important lesson early on in my practice in Belfast that kept me in good stead. So sometimes you need to move in together, and I think a lot of people in Belfast were waiting for me to show some sign that I was going to stay and not leave them. And buying a house does that. We've actually lived in this house now since our daughter was born. Our first child was born many, many years ago. And that in the lower right is my family more recently when we were on vacation together. Show affection. There are many, many, many ways we can show affection to our patients, and how important that is. Certainly shaking their hand, or under those certain circumstances, hugging them is an important way of showing affection. Spending extra time in conversation with them is an important way of showing affection for them. But for me, it's always been important at major transitions in life, and especially at death, to either write a little letter of condolence or to actually go to a wake or to a funeral. This is a photograph of Brooks, Maine in the wintertime, a small community to the north of Belfast. And my partner and I, Tim Hughes, when there were just two of us in practice together, had for a period of time, for about a year, we had taken over for a doctor who had left, who had retired, and until they had found a new doctor, they asked us to fill in. So we went a couple of days a week to Brooks, Maine. And over that time, we delivered a number of babies of the families in Brooks. We admitted them to the hospital. We cared for them in our office. And it was really a wonderful getting out of Belfast into a size of community I grew up with. I grew up in a community of 750, and Belfast is 7,500. So it doesn't really seem like rural medicine to me, but this was rural medicine for sure. Anyway, a resident of that community, Trish, I got to know through our MAT support groups, medication-assisted treatment for opioid use disorder support groups. And Trish was this amazing, she was really she was really the canary in the coal mine. When things were going badly in the group, her expression showed it. When people weren't showing up, weren't keeping their commitment to the group, she would worry about them and call them and say, "Where are you? I'm worried about you." She had that wonderful motherly personality of making us feel like we were one group. This group of 10 or 12 who came regularly to our support, to our MAT group. Trish had a hard life. She was born with congenital anomalies, and that was her early exposure to narcotic pain medication. She was a very anxious woman. She had a lot of bad luck in her life, much of it brought on by herself. I remember time and again we would struggle with, Trish has now wrecked the car that her parents bought for her. She lost another job for reasons that I couldn't understand. She got a divorce, and she really felt her life was a total disaster, and she was a total loser. But she did do one thing, and that was raise two beautiful children, wonderful children for whom she was very proud. We kept reminding her of that. One day, I remember it very distinctly, it was about a half an hour before our support group, our MAT group was to meet. I got a phone call from Trish's sister, who, by the way, always believed that what we were doing with treating patients with buprenorphine as just exchanging one drug from another. She was very suspicious for what we were doing, didn't exactly understand it or trust it exactly. Anyway, I got a phone call saying that Trish had been found dead in her bed that morning, which floored me, because she had been doing so well. She'd been making progress, and it didn't seem to me that her heart condition was causing any problems for her. And so I relayed that to the group, and it hit the whole group as very difficult. The next day, I got another phone call from the sister who said, I just wanted you to know that there are a lot of messages on her cell phone between her and another member of the group, talking about drugs and exchanging drugs and buying and trading drugs. Do you think this has anything to do with her cause of death? And I started to wonder about all that and my role and my culpability in not recognizing that maybe things were going in the wrong direction for Trish. And I, as did her family, felt a great responsibility for her death. The family did not want an autopsy, not even a drug screen, but I knew at that moment that somehow I needed to show them, we needed to get together, family, friends, and doctor, to support each other through this death we didn't quite understand and felt responsible for and were grieving. And so I went out to the wake. And it was the most remarkable event of my life, practically. Well, having children was pretty remarkable. But a truly deeply rewarding experience of being around Trish's family, her friends, old acquaintances who I knew from our days there many years ago. And it was simply an opportunity for a community to come together and say to each other, with honesty and with compassion, we did the best we could. Trish was a truly amazing human being. And whatever the circumstances of her death, we stand together and celebrate her and celebrate the progress she made and the children that she gave to the world. So showing affection through going to a wake or writing a letter of condolence or giving a hug is so important in creating our solidarity with the community. Making a long-term investment. One of the things I enjoy doing is karaoke. Karaoke in the Belfast area usually involves bars that doctors probably shouldn't go to, but are the most fun, honestly. And this is Country Rose in Belfast, which actually closed down last year because the owner got into trouble with some drug dealings. But anyway. Wonderful karaoke there. And I'm sure it'll be bought by someone else, and when you come to Belfast to visit, we can all sing together. So anyway, this is the waitresses at Country Rose. I remember the first time I went there, how important it was for me to sit down with my friends and have a beer, have a pitcher on the table, and have people, old patients, come up to me and say, Dr. Loxterkamp, you're Dr. Loxterkamp, right? I think they had trouble believing it at first. And you delivered my son, or you delivered my daughter, you delivered all my kids. What a great feeling it is when one gets to the point in your career when delivering babies no longer, one can no longer accommodate that, and to see the fruits of one's labor, with the labor with patients to create families. So I'm very thankful to places like Country Rose, where my patients came to thank me for my time and my experience with them. Widen the circle. This is probably the most important room in our office in Belfast. This is a room where we met every Thursday morning to have a conversation as providers, to discuss how the week was going, how our patients were doing, our sense of frustration or grief or confusion about being a doctor in a small town. And from this grew many of the stories that I wrote about over the years. Certainly from this grew my 2 books and my many articles. So a wonderful place to get together and just be human and supportive of one another. And this is also the place where we then launched the Old Duffers Club. The gentlemen you see in the lower right are all members of the first Old Duffers Club. And these are men who well, maybe if there's time at the end, I'll tell the story of how we started. But a group of gentlemen who all they needed really was to get together and support one another as they were going blind, as they were forced to move into smaller housing, as their spouses died, as they could no longer do the things that made them feel fully human. They came together and supported each other in this room. And this is also the room where we conducted our MAT support groups. So quite an important room, a circle of people just getting together and trying to live a complicated life. And then lastly, on widening the circle, I love doing home visits for this reason. You come to a home, you're greeted by someone who welcomes you, who is host to you, who offers you cookies and tea and whatever else they have to offer, including their friendship. And then you also allow them to bring out their pills that they always forget to bring into the office. And so this is a woman who, you know how one thing leads to another. Well, some time ago, she had come in and her TSH was slightly elevated. She was, pre-hypothyroid, or whatever the term is nowadays. Anyway, she was started on thyroid medication. Whether this was a direct cause or an indirect cause, she went into atrial fibrillation, from which she was then started on warfarin to prevent stroke, which caused her to bleed slowly, and she became very anemic, for which she was started on iron, which caused constipation. And in all the medicines she was now on, some 10 or 12 or 15 medications she was now on, she was taking PPIs for indigestion. We took away all of them. She remained in atrial fibrillation, but she didn't want to be anticoagulated, and so we left it there. Lastly, what do you do in a small town? You work for what you believe in. The man in the middle is Mike McFadden. He's the police chief in Belfast. And a while ago, when I realized another place I hang out in Belfast, which is still in operation, and I highly encourage you to come and have a beer there, is Rowley's Bar and Grill. What became clear to me in Rowley's is that if a person falls off the bar stool and has a concussion, or trips as they're leaving Rowley's and hits their head on the pavement, the police will be there in 2 or 3 minutes. Their office is just up the street, but the volunteer ambulance service will be there in 15 or 20 minutes, and so you have to get the patient stabilized before the ambulance arrived. And it struck me that in cases of overdose, it's no good to only have the ambulance have Narcan. Everyone else, the police need to have Narcan, and teachers need to have Narcan, and on and on. And so we went down, my partner and I, Tim Hughes, went down to the police station, sat in the waiting room and said we'd like to talk with Chief McFadden. And he was very, very busy, but he kind of peeked out from his desk, and he saw us sitting there. And of course, we knew him quite well. We cared for his family, and he invited us in, ushered us in. I said, you know, we need to talk about the importance of the police in Belfast, all of them carrying Narcan, which he agreed to do, and put a thank you note in the paper some months later, after they had saved several lives in Waldo County as a result of carrying Narcan. And so I ran into him where I ran into most people in Belfast, at the Hannaford supermarket, and we greeted each other, and he said, I just want to thank you for letting us be a greater service to Waldo County and Belfast for carrying Narcan. And I said, questioned him, I said, so why did you listen to us? Because I knew there was resistance on the force to carrying a drug like Narcan. And he said, anytime 2 doctors sit in my waiting room to talk to me, I'm going to listen to them. And that's just carrying our authority as family doctors to where it needs to go, for what needs to be done. Work for what you believe in. We also need to be in nursing homes very desperately. Many, many people there have no voice, and we may be their only voice. We must be where people without voice require us to speak for them. And the slide on the right is a slide about osteoporosis at the lumbocervical junction, and some of the policies in our hospital, I'm sure not unlike policies in your hospital, that are there for the ease and the comfort of doctors more so than patients, and I won't go into that right now. So how do we now align our needs with theirs, with those of our patients? I'm going to read you something that really moved me a number of years ago. If you don't get the Writer's Almanac every day in your mailbox, in your email box, I encourage you to do so. This came up a number of years ago, written by Irene Klepfitz on the 45th anniversary of the Warsaw Uprising, and it really made a powerful impression on me. She said, "What we grieve for is not the loss of a grand vision, but rather the loss of common things, events and gestures. Ordinariness is the most precious thing we struggle for, what the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto fought for. Not noble causes or abstract theories, but the right to go on living with a sense of purpose and a sense of self-worth in ordinary life." And who in our practices these days struggles for an ordinary life? Well, it's the people who are isolated in their old age. Those of our patients who suffer from addiction, our patients with mental illness, our patients who are desperately poor and don't have the money to come see us or the wherewithal in terms of transportation to be there. These are the people who are seeking an ordinary life that we can make an important impact with. Again, the shut-ins, the homeless, the addicted, the mentally ill, those outside our normal circle, the ones who normally walk through our office door. The most powerful message to me on what health is, the most powerful definition is that by Wendell Berry, who said in a beautiful essay that I encourage you to look up and read, is called "Health is Membership, Health is Connection." Sebastian Junger wrote a beautiful book about this not too long ago called Tribe, in which he looked at why is it that during the westward expansion, as settlers, white settlers were moving through this area to the west, why did almost none of them run to join the Native American population? Why did none of the Native American population run to join the settlers, civilized people, and so many settlers joined the Native Americans? He also then contrasted that with war. He's actually a war correspondent and worked in Iraq and Afghanistan. And what he saw in both circumstances was what built community, what people needed to feel connected to one another. He saw that egalitarianism and freedom were two sides of the same coin. He saw that sacrifice led to loyalty, and loyalty bred sacrifice. And overall, the important thing was to build connection with one's peers. So, what should we be doing as we try to create community for our patients, bring them back into community? What should we be doing? We should be modeling it in our own offices. What would a model practice look like? Well, it would have some autonomy to the business being run by our CEOs. It would be an appropriate size, not so big that we lose track of the people inside of our offices, their names, their circumstances, their lives, but rather maybe 15 or 20 people. This is where we ought to be practicing, but even more importantly, training you all, our young and next generation of family physicians. We ought to be using appropriate technology, including Project ECHO sorts of enterprises and telemedicine. We ought to be looking at a well-defined unit of care. And what would that well-defined unit look like? Well, it would certainly involve a care manager, a behavioral therapist, a physical therapist, a clinical pharmacist. But it's so hard to get us to work together as teams, and it takes a real effort, a real commitment to do that. We must get out of our offices and be in the community, to know the community, as I did in terms of my work as a county coroner, making home visits, and working with the community leaders to make sure we were serving those in our community. We should be a teaching site. That has certainly kept me on my toes. I see in the audience a couple of people who educated me, Sarah Happel, Dr. Eisenhower, Eric Brown, Dr. Mel Madrona. We need to be a teaching site and continue to ask questions about what is the most important thing that our patients need in family medicine and how can we provide that. And lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about the arts. This is our practice in Belfast. Again, a small office. This is 11,000 square feet, but we had all the components of what I felt are the unit of care necessary. You know, well, there is a huge problem with burnout these days, and we certainly talk about it and feel it. And I think one of the major contributors of burnout is not being able to provide for our patients what they really need. And oftentimes, it's the care manager who finds for them what they really need in terms of help with subsidized housing, help with food stamps, help with knowing where the food shelter is and how to get the food kitchen is and how to get to it, or how to get to a women's shelter, and on and on and on. So we really need to constellate the team our patients need. The arts and the humanities can teach us many, many things. A couple of books to recommend to you. One new in 2019 called Range by David Epstein talks about what generalists can do to help us understand the possibilities before us, and also The Reflective Practitioner, a much older book, but also talk about how we can engage patients where they are and not just where we are. In Range, David Epstein talks about willingness to drop your tools. Gives a good example of firefighters in a couple of great Western fires a number of years ago. Experienced firefighters, veteran firefighters, who in escaping a blaze that had begun to overtake them, ran with all of their gear on and died. And those who had the wherewithal to drop their gear made far greater progress and survived. And he uses this example to say we all need to be willing to drop our tools. What are our tools in family medicine? What are our tools in medicine, I should say? And that is the authority of our white coat, which we sometimes need to drop in terms to relate to people more authentically. We need to drop our expectation that patients will come see us in the office when we could easily as enough, and maybe for them more easily, see them in their homes or in their community. We need to sometimes drop our magical belief in evidence-based medicine and do what patients feel they need and help them get what they feel they need in a safe way. So we need to learn by analogy when we don't understand. We need to adjust our diagnosis when patients aren't improving, a huge problem in medicine, and we need to drop our tools when the crisis demands. I think also what we need to do is rethink our educational process. Do we really need 4 years of graduate education when family doctors in Canada have 2 years, and the vast majority still do 2 years of education there? Only 30% go on to pursue fellowships, and usually it's a fellowship specifically to learn a skill they need in that community, such as giving anesthesia or working in an emergency department. Maybe there ought to be just 2 years of residency, internship and residency, and then another year of focused study for those who want it. But what's really, really important, and what Northern Light Family Medicine Residency taught me, was the importance of coming back and learning again in the context of a residency program, skills that I've long since forgotten, new information that I was never exposed to. I think in practice, it's very easy to go to continuing education that you're interested in, but maybe your patients don't need quite as much. So there's nothing like coming back to a residency program and relearning and learning anew what's necessary, what are the changes in medicine. So our small contribution at Northern Light is to launch the main Arts and Humanities in Medicine Fellowship. There are many, many wonderful things going on in the arts and humanities in an effort to open up our hearts and minds as family doctors to better understand ourselves and so therefore care for our patients. Much of this occurs in medical schools, some of it is now filtering into residency. Our particular contribution at Northern Light is that we are First of all, because we don't have the resources to put on a fellowship like this on our own. We're coupling with the University of Maine, which is a 15-minute drive away. And secondly, I think it's wonderful that you all get exposed to the arts and humanities in residency. But how do you keep that alive in practice, especially when your employers don't support it and you feel you don't have time to do it? What can we do to prepare you for a life that involves the arts and humanities? The arts and humanities of the type that sustain me in my writing and sustain others in their painting and so forth. So be happy to talk to anyone after this talk about arts and humanities in medicine fellowship, but I'm going to leave it right there for now. This is what that fellowship would look like, 50% in practice, the ability to work on a thesis, 20% classwork, and 10% seminar. So I'm going to close by saying this, and especially to all of you young in your training and young in your practices, the future of family medicine, which is changing as society is changing, will require new thinking, new ways of living, new ways of expressing ourselves, of listening to our patients and learning from them. And I charge you all to come up with your own solutions as we move into this new era of maybe not quite so much family medicine anymore, but generalist medicine, employing all the values that I went into family medicine for and that you've come into family medicine to share and to give to your patients. It's a difficult time. It's a confusing time, and in some ways, my confusion, how do I end a career in medicine, is the same kind of confusion as to how you begin one. I want to go back to one more poem by Wendell Berry, who wrote about the real work. His poem, The Real Work. It may be that when we no longer know what to do, we have come to our real work. And that when we no longer know which way to go, we have come to our real journey. The mind that is not baffled is not employed. The impeded stream is the one that sings. So this could be summarized in just a couple of lines by Antonio Machado, who I learned about on the Camino, which I went on a number of years ago. And he said, "Traveler, there is no way. The way is made by walking." So I hope in the years that I have left as a professional in family medicine, I can walk with you a part of that way. But you all are going to go on long after I've done my job, and your job becomes one of caring for me and my patients and our communities. So I have great faith knowing the residents at Northern Light, probably not unlike all of you and medical students, we can do this, but it's going to take opening our minds, opening our hearts, and being able to sing for our supper, sing for our ability to care for those we are in this job to care for. Thank you very much. And I'm going to take any time for questions later. Yep.